I had been sent up from the lowland tea gardens in the cool season of 1913 to settle a string of boundary disputes among the hill holdings when the men began to speak, in the low, urgent tones of those who keep plantations in Assam, of a silent thing that moved the ridge at night. We set out under the flag of British India with compasses, a pocket chronometer, and Lee Enfields. But what we followed into the hills was less a dispute than a warning come true. I led a small party from the district of Dibrugarh. 3 planters besides myself, 2 Assamese coolies whose faces the cold had roped with windburn, a mahout with his elephant, and a pair of pack ponies, on an afternoon when the light fell thinly through mist, and the tea gardens behind us seemed to exhale the year. Our purpose, plainly stated at the bungalow over a flask of chai, was to inspect a remote slope where tea bushes had been torn, and accounts from the hill tenants disagreed. The supervisor insisted there be no mistake to paper nor to line, for the estates were closely held, and the Assam Company liked its boundaries tidy. We packed with the care of men who had crossed rivers and the occasional Lushai tract. Kerosene lamps in oilskins, tins of hard biscuits and condensed milk, a surveyor's compass and folded maps marked in pencil with hedge lines and watercourses, coils of hemp rope for taking levels or hauling when the ponies slipped. Each of the planters had a Lee Enfield slung across a shoulder, rifles polished but not readied to fire. And I kept my pocket chronometer against my ribs, setting it by the sun as we left at 3 o'clock and noting the time in my notebook with a neat, practiced hand. The mahout sat high upon the elephant's neck, his dander across his knees. The beast's great head moved with a slow, habitual intelligence, and it bore our tools and a spare coil of tarpaulin and more rope than prudence demanded. The coolies carried the smaller things, the compass box in a leather case, a tin of red touch paper, lengths of measuring chain, and an old brass theodolite that had belonged to the estate surveyor. I remember the smell most keenly, the sharp green sap of the freshly plucked bushes left behind us, the damp loam of the path, the iron tang of the oil lamps, and beneath all, the faint, warm musk of the elephant's breath as it crossed behind my horse. The track grew steeper and narrower at first. It ran between tea terraces. The plants clipped into green waves. Then it climbed into scrub and young sal. The men spoke less as the slope took them. The supervisor consulted the pencil marks on the map and the sun in my chronometer and nodded. At the third bend, we found the evidence that had stirred the tenantry. Rows of bushes uprooted as if by a slow hand, the soil between their roots heaped and overturned, branches stripped and hung like discarded rope across the lower hedgerows. There were no human tracks to account for the messing, no boot prints of size and tread to match the pony shoes, and the elephant, a veteran of many circuits, shied and snorted in a manner I had not seen before, its ears flashing white. The coolies moved to clear a line, their knives flashed, and they spoke in Assamese to the mahout, who answered with low, clipped words I did not understand. Night drew on with an early cold kerosene lamps were lit and guttered in the damp air, casting the men's faces into small moons of light. We set the theodolite upon a tripod to take bearings. I tightened the screws of my chronometer and checked the compass against the magnetic needle. There was a peculiar hush upon the ridge, not quite the absence of sound, but a thing like restraint. Bamboo leaves that did not fall, a distant barking that stopped short as though cut off. The supervisor looked to me with an expression I took for professional unease. I could not ignore it. We made our preparations to ascend in the failing light, tying blankets and securing biscuits, while the elephant stood with its trunk curled and the mahout frowning at the line of torn tea below. I noted the bearings we set out: lanterns bobbing, ropes slung, rifles uncomfortably heavy across our backs, and the hills seemed to watch us as we went upward toward the slope where the tea lay mangled, and where, according to the men, the silent mountain beast came down at night. We left the last of the tea gardens when the lamps of the bungalows guttered down to pinpricks and the paths grew soft with mud. It was October of 1909. The monsoon had only just loosened its hold, and the upland nights were fat with damp and the jasmine-pungent air of Assam, yet oddly silent. No snipe calls, no rustle of langur through bamboo, only a low, wet wind that seemed to run ahead of us from the Brahmaputra's unseen headwaters. My coolies moved like a string of dark beads. They hushed when we passed the ruined bungalow where the foreman had waited earlier, his face a map of small fears. He spoke, in halting Assamese, of vanished goats and of a name I could not master, Dolang, turning it over as though it were an unpleasant taste. The landscape itself seemed to hold its breath beneath a low, rope-like fog. We were lightly equipped for reconnaissance. My field glass, folding rule, aneroid barometer, pocket compass, and a single regulation rifle slung at my shoulder for emergencies. My notebook was already damp at the edges. I kept it in an oilskin. We carried tins of rice, salted pork, an old bullock of lime for the coolie's cook, and spare cartridges in a leather pouch. For navigation, I relied upon the survey of India sheet and a prismatic compass. The official practice was to take bearings at every quarter mile, and I made the men stop to mark our progress upon the map whenever the fog thinned sufficiently to see the valley. The evidence began small and required a certain patience to assemble. At first, there were the goat pens, gates unlatched, ropes gnawed through, the shingles of a shed torn as if by a child's. Impatience. Then the ground told a different tale. I measured with the folding rule a set of impressions that were not goat tracks, too large, rounded, and splayed, each print alone, as if the animal had weighed differently with every step. Between the prints lay tufts of coarse hair, darker than the goat's and matted with the clay of the upland soil. One of the coolies, an older man named Ramu, stooped and held up a strand to the lantern. His hand trembled, not from cold, but from something like recognition. He muttered Dolang again, and the name rolled through the damp like a pebble in a pool. At dusk, the fog thinned, and we spread out a small circle around the remains of a tea trail. I ordered silent sentries at the 4 points and had the men trim the lampwick to a steady glow. We set snares as a precaution, simple loops of rope, and marked each with a twig. These were practical measures. Not bravado in matters of the wild one is first a student of caution. I examined the barometer. The aneroid read a fall that suggested a local eddy of weather, the sort of stillness that sometimes heralds unfamiliar movement in the hills. We did not sleep well. Once, in the hour before midnight, I heard a sound that was neither animal nor holy wind. A long, low exhalation from the slope above, as if some great chest had sighed. The sentries did not move one of them. Young Jatindra looked at me and nodded toward the ridge. We extinguished the lamp and eased across the trail with only the compass and the moon to guide us. The hair on my forearms was prickled by the cold and by a sense of being watched, a scruple of observation that has always served me better than courage. On the ridge, the fog thinned to a rope of vapor coiling between the stunted rhododendron. There, at the edge of a small clearing, we found a fresh disturbance, a branch broken cleanly at shoulder height and the imprint of that same broad foot in the churned earth. When I held my field glass steady, I thought I saw beyond the trees a darker shape, too large for any dog, too silent for deer, slipping between trunks with the deliberateness of something that knew the country by moonlight. We dared a single shot into the air, not to wound, but to warn. The report trembled and seemed to settle, and the shape did not return. We made camp at the trail for the remainder of the night, minds occupied with measurements and debate. Some of the party urged retreat to the gardens and the safety of the bungalows. Others, including myself, argued to follow the spoor at first light. We did not reach a conclusion before exhaustion took us. I closed my eyes with the notebook under my hand and the compass over my heart, the image of that dark, patient thing lingering at the edge of sleep. When morning came, the fog lay thicker, and the stakes we had set were gone, not taken, but pushed flat, as if by something that had passed with deliberate care. We packed with measured speed, our instruments damp, our mouths quiet. We had proofs enough to follow, and we followed them upward into the hills toward the headwaters, the name Dolang in our mouths like an unfinished sentence. The ascent narrowed into a promise of discovery, and the trail ahead was all shadow and expectation. We pushed off from the gardens before the sun cleared the Darjeeling range, the world wet with the night's rains, and the leaves still shedding little rivers down to the paths. Our bullock cart creaked with chests of broken Assam leaf, and a spare mahogany crate for samples we took with us, 2 Lee Enfield rifles, a spare box of .303 cartridges, a pocket compass, and the gardener's iron spade. The men moved with the practiced caution of those who knew these slopes. Boots sank in the sod, brass buttons dulled by tea dust. I carried the lamp we had hung in the planter's shed, a kerosene affair with a brass peg and a smoked glass globe, because light seemed an honest instrument against the dark. At first, there was only practical evidence. Tea bushes ripped from their roots in neat arcs, young plants torn as if by a careful hand, rather than careless trampling the mahogany crate we intended to secure for the afternoons. Samples lay split upon the track, grain splayed and nails sheared, as if a great weight had been set and then lifted again. Footprints marked the wet earth where the cart had passed, elongated impressions too large and too narrow for a bear, their length measured at about the span of my boot sole, and the mud compacted under that narrow heel in a way that made the tone almost pointed. I traced one with my finger. The edge of it came away with the smell of loam and crushed fern. We followed the spoor uphill toward a ridge that ran like a spine above the gardens, leaving the last of the cleared tea in our wake and entering stands of rhododendron and tall bamboo. The air changed. Kerosene and boiled tea were replaced by the resinous scent of living wood and a dampness that sat on one's lungs. Branches had been broken cleanly at about a man's chest-height bark stripped in parallel lines, as though something moved with a breadth we could not judge from below. Once, a strip of mahogany bark lay peeled and folded back, and I thought of a hand, a paw, a face pressed there. We resolved to make a night watch above the most recent damage. Andrews volunteered to sit with me. His face was a map of the last sunburn and many squints. We propped the lamp in the fork of a young oak and fastened it with twine. The lamp was knocked from its peg without wind. The glass cracked with a delicate final sound and lay among the leaves like the hull of a small moon. No gust had passed, yet the flame guttered and went dull. We found no hand, no cord. Later, from the black downslope beyond our lamp, there came an absence rather than a voice. No growl, no cry, only a heavy, soft thudding, like a very large animal walking on moss. The step long and paced, not the frantic cadence of a wounded thing. We fired a single warning shot into the dark, the report cracking like a pistol of fate. The thudding stopped. For a long minute, we heard only water in the gullies and the breathing of men. After that stillness, Andrew said, quite ordinary, it wasn't a biped. He had seen prints close together in the mud, staggered, then separated as though whatever made them had reared and then set down again in a longer stride. I had with me field notes and a pencil stub. I drew the impressions under the lamp's pallid light, noting width and length, the inward angle of the foot. There were no claws set in the prints, no distinct pad that matched any of our zoological manuals. We did not pursue at once. Our provisions were limited, the hill held no clear path, and the monsoon could come without notice. We made a plan to ascend the ridge at dawn with a larger party and ropes, to take bearings with a pocket compass, and to mark each find with strips of white calico. I slept little that night. There was an ache in my shoulders, as if I had carried not only a pack, but the weight of something watching. At first light, we found where the thudding had gone, a line of crushed moss leading to a small hollow, and there, caught on a root, a swathe of dark hair as fine as bristles. The hair did not match any specimen in our chest, nor any of the goats that grazed near the lower gardens. We readied ourselves, shouldered rifles, and checked flint and primer. The men exchanged brief, necessary words, and the gardener tightened his grip on the spade. We followed the hollow, climbing toward pines and cloud, the spoor ahead seeming to decide for us the route. The creature's presence lay in the disturbances. The torn tea, the broken crate, the lamp shattered beside our peg, but not in a shape we could name. We moved as an expedition moves when a map has given out, by measured steps, by sound, by the small certainties of equipment and habit. The ridge held its own silence, and under that silence, the moss still thudded, somewhere lower down, like the tread of a thing deciding to wait. We had left the low rows of the tea gardens well after dusk, when the plantations gave up their day and the country sank into a damp, low-voiced night. Lanterns swung like small moons between the planters. The mahout rode his elephant as if the beast itself were a spare lamp, its broad head a moving shadow beneath the canvas of fog. The men carried field glasses and the usual accoutrements of such patrols. A canvas map rolled in oilcloth, a compass with a lid that stuck in the cold, a bandolier of 303 cartridges for the Lee Enfield, and, pinned against rain and the smell of tea leaves, woolen coats stiff with damp. We stalked the sound as one stalks a wounded animal, slowly, ears straining, breath shallow. The country was a confusion of rhododendron and granite, rising in ribs every step upward, robbed the lanterns of light, the fog thickening to a curtain that took sound from the world. Once, a branch spoke under a boot, and a man cursed softly once. The elephant snorted and shuffled, its great footfalls leaving the ground like distant thunder. Then the mahout's hand tightened, and the creature shied and fell silent. For a long moment, nothing moved, but that folded elephant breath and the little pool of light about our lamps. Through a narrow slit in the fog, I saw it, at first but a suggestion, the shape of a low hill lifting and walking. It was taller than a man at the shoulder, yet built with a lithe restraint that betrayed no lumbering bulk. Its outline broke the night, as if someone had cut a long, dark stone loose and set it upon its legs. There was no cry from it, no guttural challenge. The only motion was measured, deliberate, as though the beast were marking us for the smallest of details and then deciding we merited inspection. I remember the sound of my own heart as one thinks of a bell in another room, present and distant. I brought the field glasses to my eye and counted muscle and fur and a head that moved with a cat's economy. The men around me likewise leaned forward with lanterns cupped to better sight. We were some 20 paces off when instinct, the old planter's instinct, made me thumb the bolt of my Lee Enfield. I had not meant to fire, but recoil and habit conspired. The report cracked the fog into two, and the bullet went cleanly into the mist. It had no apparent effect. The beast made not a sound, and yet it was gone, as if the night itself had swallowed it, slipping between rhododendron and granite with the possession of the ground that was not ours. We fanned out, 2 men to the right with lanterns held high, 3 to the left feeling for fresh prints. The mahout beat the elephant's flank until the creature moved, no longer composed, a beast that had lost a secret. We found signs, a trail of broken rhododendron branches set low and neat, not jagged as a boar's would be, but clipped a smear of coarse, dark hair caught upon a thorn, not more than a scrap, yet unmistakable to a man's fingers. In the soft loam near a water run, there were impressions longer than any man's boot and oddly spaced. 4 or 5 blunt oval marks, each set as if to balance a body that carried its weight differently. No blood, no struggle, only evidence of passage. The men were shaken in ways that did not show in wounds. One of the planters, Rajan, sat upon a stone with his head in his hands and would not speak for a long time. The mahout would not mount his elephant again until dawn, and even then, he fed it opium to settle its nerves. We gathered cartridges and counted by the dull light of lanterns, careful as men who had come close but had not won any trophy. I set down the compass and wrote my notes with a hand that trembled, though I had seen many a leaping tiger in the decade I had spent in these hills. We debated posture until the fog thinned into a steady rain that made our shoulders cold. Should we follow at first light? Should we send a small party with traps? None of the usual stratagems seemed fitting for a thing that moved without sound and left no trail of rage. At last, we agreed to return to the gardens, to marshal a proper party with ropes, stronger torches, and a day's rations. The country was not a place to hunt by chance. We made our retreat under a weather that washed the prints as we watched. By the time we reached the first tea bungalow, the only remnants were the hair upon the thorn and a memory set in the faces of the men. The elephant refused to be near the slope again. Rajan dreamed badly for 3 nights thereafter and would not go beyond the first line of tea for a week. I kept a strip of that hair in this journal, folded and pressed. I left the hills that night with more questions than certainties, and with the sense that some old thing kept its silence because silence preserved its advantage. We had not been mauled. We had not been marked in ways that the world understands. Still, among the planters and mahouts, there grew a watchfulness that lasted through that season and into the next, a tacit acknowledgement that the mountain held a presence we had not yet learned to name. We beat a retreat to the bungalow at first light, leading the elephant and saving the damaged stores. Dawn broke in a grey wash over the tea gardens, the air already thick with the reek of crushed leaves and damp earth. My men moved with the measured haste of those who had slept in clothes and waked to alarm before. The elephant staggered under the howdah, its side flecked with the red of torn burlap and sugar-stiffened mud. A crate of kerosene lay smashed in its wake, and 2 cases of tinned beef had been trampled to a pulpy mess. I had my revolver, 2 double-barreled shotguns, and a small canvas satchel of cartridges and oil between counting rounds and bandaging a cut to Harrin's hand. I took stock of what could be carried and what must be abandoned. We lashed what remained to the saddle, wrapped the tents in canvas, and loaded what stores the bullock cart could hold. The track to the bungalow was a ribbon of red clay and loose stone that climbed and dipped beneath the low hills. The elephant picked its way with the cautious deliberation of one who sensed danger. At times it would halt and frown at the ridgeline, the great ears held still as if listening for a summons. Silence fell upon us like a second cloak. No bird call, no rustle of snipe wings, only the slow creak of harness and the slap of the bullock's hooves. Once I paused and peered up the slope. The bushes there were undisturbed save for a sweep, as if some huge body had passed, and the dew on the grass along the crest shimmered as though under 100 tiny eyes. No sound came from that height, only the impression of attention, as if the hills themselves had been made to regard us. At the bungalow we set a watch, and I dispatched a brief report to the district magistrate. The house was a 2-storied structure of teak and corrugated iron, its veranda still damp from last. Nights' rain lamps were trimmed, kettles boiled, and men spoke in low, uncertain tones, while I wrote the facts as plainly as I could. Night fires, the tracks upon the ridge, the sudden absence of one of our coolies, Ram, whose footprints ceased halfway up the slope, and the size and silence of whatever had passed. I made note of the stores damaged and of the elephant's state. The magistrate read my hand with official patience, made a formal entry in the estate ledger as incident involving supposed wild beast, and offered the customary caution: send a patrol, keep to daylight, avoid the ridges. In town, the matter was spoken of with a shake of the head and the usual ready explanation: panther, rabid elephant, fevered imagination brought on by the monsoon. The ledger's penciled lines sat beside accounts of tea sales and salaries. In that neat, ledgered hand, my night was reduced to an item. We did what prudence required. Patrols were sent at dawn for a week, baited with salted meat and with men who knew the ways of the hills, but they returned with few marks beyond broken underbrush and a larger set of indentations than any known feline could make. The elephant refused thereafter to cross the lower ridge, where we had first seen the sweep of those great prints she would trumpet and plant her feet, and no amount of coaxing would bring her forward. Men who had time in the jungle spoke in whispers by the kitchens, and others began to sleep with knives beneath their mattresses. We stationed a lantern on the highest veranda each night, and more than once the light caught a gleam on the far skyline that vanished when called for. For years afterwards, the planters of that district spoke in lowered voices of the silent mountain beast. There was no body, no clear explanation, only the memory of a night when the hills themselves seemed to have eyes. The estate ledger held my entry like a pall, thin penciled lines that would not answer. In the moil of seasons, with rains and harvests and the steady commerce of tea, the question remained lodged in the record and in the lives of those who watched the ridgelines. What had passed that night and never returned? I have written this down because a man's duty is to bear witness yet. When I look toward those hills now, years older and no nearer to an answer, I still feel the old smallness and the certainty that some things in the hills kept their counsel.